You ready? Let's do this.
All right. Welcome back to the Oklahoma podcast, everyone, where we explore the stories behind the science that's shaping Oklahoma's health future. I'm your host, and today we are diving deep into the world of implementation science, health equity, and the power of real-world data to transform lives. Our guest today represents the cutting edge of what it means to be a researcher practitioner in the 21st century. At a time when Oklahoma faces some of the nation's most pressing health challenges, ranking 45th in overall health outcomes, with rural areas experiencing provider shortages affecting over 2 million residents, we need pioneers and leaders who can bridge the gap between breakthrough science and real-world impact. And today's guest embodies this bridge-building role. As a professor and the Children's Health Foundation Endowed Research Chair in Pediatrics at the University of Oklahoma Health Sciences, and also the Chief Research Informatics Officer, he's at the forefront of using data, not just to understand problems, but to solve them. His work spans from preventing adverse childhood experiences, where Oklahoma ranks amongst the worst in the nation, to modernizing how we capture and use health information to drive policy change. What makes his work particularly compelling is how he's pioneered the Oklahoma Adversity Surveillance Index System, or OSS, which has revealed that Oklahoma's children face ACEs at rates consistently above the national average across most counties. But more than just documenting problems, his team is using this data to target interventions where they are needed most. Today, we'll explore what it means to lead with data in a state where health disparities run deep, how technology can serve equity rather than widening gaps, and what it takes to translate complex research into actionable change. We'll explore the ethical considerations of using AI and other emerging technologies in healthcare, particularly when working with vulnerable populations. So whether you're a researcher, a clinician, a policymaker, or simply someone who cares about Oklahoma's health future, this conversation is for you. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. David Barrett to the Oklahoma podcast. Hello.
No, thank you. Boy, you don't need me. You know this better than I do. So appreciate the invitation. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. And shout out to Dr. Campbell for recommending you to the podcast. I'm so glad we're finally getting to do this. Now, on the podcast, we always start from the very beginning. How and where did you grow up? And were there some events in your childhood that predicted your current path?
It's always a hard question to answer. So I was actually born in Oklahoma, but I was not raised here. So my parents went to Oklahoma Baptist University. I was born in Shawnee, Oklahoma, but less than 6 months of age, we moved away and we moved to Missouri. And really between the ages of 0 and 10, we moved around quite a bit. Missouri, Colorado, which is where my mother's family was from, and Iowa, which is where my father's family is from. All of that coinciding with really the start of my father's career. He was a preacher. And so he went to OUHS, got his undergraduate, went to seminary in the Kansas City area where I started elementary school, and then we bounced around between those other states. Coming back to Missouri for middle childhood, and eventually back to Colorado where I graduated high school. I do think that the bouncing around different places has sort of allowed me to be flexible in my academic pursuits, and maybe at times too flexible with wide varying interests and not always latching onto one particular area and narrowly drilling in. I've always had multiple interests and projects on my plate, but I sort of I have the appetite for it, and maybe my childhood is partially to blame for that.
Thank you for sharing that. So you moved around. You moved around quite a lot. Now, can you walk us through your educational pathway, like how you started and how you ended up what you're currently doing right now?
Yeah, another winding path there. So I was a double major as an undergraduate in math and psychology, and always assumed at some point, well, I'm gonna have to choose one of these two options or these two interests. And realized late as an upperclassman that they could be blended, and that there was this field called quantitative psychology. So I started immediately looking for graduate studies that had that subdiscipline, with an interest from an early age in health outcomes. And so I was really interested in any quantitative psychologist in the country who was studying health outcomes. There happened to be one at the time. I was at a small college in Kansas. There happened to be one just one state removed that I was somewhat familiar with, Oklahoma, and accepted an offer, ended up studying with a guy named Joe Rogers, who's a nationally known quantitative psychologist who was doing behavior genetics research on health behaviors. So that's really how I got started. Once I was at OU, I was looking for more training in health outcomes research. I met another psychologist who was at the Health Sciences Center campus and his colleagues there. So this would be Rob Ham and Dewey Scheid, two decision scientists who were studying behavioral health change broadly. And I really fell in love with that particular subdiscipline. Despite my interest in the math and the quantitative skills, I always wanted an applied outlet. And so health outcomes was my interest, and that's really what I pursued. That ended up parlaying into an internship in Department of Pediatrics in the section of genetics. And I was there for about a year, introduced to the section of developmental and behavioral pediatrics, which just coincidentally had a faculty position open for somebody with quantitative skills. And I applied, was accepted, and the rest is history.
Wow. What a path. Thanks for sharing that. So the transition from psychology to research informatics represents, I think that's a fascinating trend in, healthcare research, right? And I think if you factor that into what you're doing right now in implementation science, it makes a lot of sense because you need to understand both the human behavior and the data systems. Can you walk us through just that defining moments in your career that shifted how you think about research impact, especially in Oklahoma?
Yeah, so when I took the position in developmental and behavioral pediatrics, they have two large centers that are really internationally recognized for the work that they do. And both of them were doing dissemination and implementation science work, even before I knew what that was, maybe even before they knew what that was. So this would be the Child Study Center and the Center on Child Abuse and Neglect. And I stood on the shoulders of giants. So we just had in our own backyard Mark Chaffin, who's one of the founding fathers of the child abuse and neglect research discipline. He's a founding father of the main journal in that field, child maltreatment. And he was the editor, in fact, when I took that position. And Barbara Bonner, who was the director of the child abuse and neglect at the time, internationally recognized for her work and knowledge and wisdom in that field. And that became an early passion of mine. All the while I was working at the Child Study Center with the chair of the section, Mark Woolreich, who was an internationally recognized ADHD researcher and doing all kinds of studies in developmental disabilities and disorders. Again, sort of in the D&I space. And so I was trained from an early age, even without knowing it, in that methodology. I always wanted, again, even when I was interested in the math side, I wanted an applied interest, and I wanted the work that I was doing to have some kind of impact, societal impact that my own eyes. So I was really attracted to that section, which is why I applied for the faculty position, and in some ways got more than I bargained for because of the wealth of knowledge and expertise that already resided in those two centers. Research informatics is an interesting story because I didn't know what that was at the time, and really out of necessity had to self-train myself in databases. So I was getting data from administrative and clinical systems for both of those tracks from all over the country, even all over the world, and having to figure out how to work with large data sets. That's not something I was trained to do in graduate school. Occasionally we were collecting large data sets. They were doing a lot of statewide trials and some multi-site trials that extended the state boundaries that again forced me to better understand how databases were designed and utilized. So I had to self-train myself. I got fortunate in a colleague at Norman who was just a few years behind me.
Nice.
Had a slightly different path, almost a reverse path. He was a database expert who then later was attracted to quantitative psychology. This is Will Beasley, who I later hired as a graduate research assistant in my early days in DBP and then became a faculty member. And together we sort of blazed this trail of research informatics and the Department of Pediatrics. And it was such a useful tool or set of tools that it wasn't a secret we couldn't keep to ourselves. And so that eventually became an enterprise offering. Things like the Red Cap system, those are early days of tools that we used to facilitate the work we're doing in DBP that we realized others could also be leaning on. And then eventually the clinical research data warehouse, when our own work was sort of bleeding into what was happening on the clinical side here. And we were, for our participants in research studies, wanting to look at some of their health utilization outcomes and pulling from our own local EMRs. That was really the early makings of our clinical research data warehouse.
Yeah.
And when the healthcare organization side found out about it and got tired of me asking for data from them incessantly, they wanted a partner. And it wasn't just me, of course. There were several others on campus wanting to repurpose that data for research. And we seemed to know what we were doing, or at least that was the impression we were giving at the time. And so with a little bit of seed funding, we got that clinical research data warehouse off the ground. It's been really thriving ever since.
Oh, nice. You do so much, and thanks for sharing, all of what you've built in the foundation that has led you to where you currently are right now. I think the next natural segue to my question would be about balancing it all, right? You're a researcher, you wear multiple hats, which is increasingly common, but also increasingly challenging, right? I read it, I think it was a study that I read a while ago, that research leaders spend an average of, I think, 6 out of 10% of their time, 6 out of 10 of their time, so 60% of their time on admin tasks, leaving less time for direct research activities. And then, so you wear many hats: professor, a chair, Chief Research Informatics Officer, and every other thing you do. How do you balance it all?
Not well. Yeah.
That's humbling, because we're all drowning here. But you make it look so easy, though.
Well, on paper, and I try to stick to this as best I can, but obviously it's a constant juggling act. But I'm 50% in my own research lab, and so the DBP early days, I was really on the support side. But 6-7 years into that, I started becoming PI on my own D&I implementation grants, and really fell in love with that area, particularly child abuse and neglect, and as you mentioned earlier, adverse childhood experiences more broadly. So I run a lab now called Embracer that really focuses on that research. We are sort of nationally recognized for not just being involved in the problem identification phase, which is largely how the ACEs field has been preoccupied for the last 20-25 years, but actually looking at interventions. So that's sort of a separator for us, and one of the secrets to success, I think, of our continuous grant funding on the lab side in that area. Looking at early preventative interventions, particularly those that are embedded in real-world settings, and focusing on the D&I aspect of how do we implement evidence-based practices with quality to see real-world impact.
Yeah.
So 50% of the time is dedicated to that. The other 50% of the time, and this has changed over the course of history here, but after the clinical research data warehouse was born, and there was this desire and need for many of these services that we were using in my lab and in pediatrics to be utilized across campus, that really culminated in the acceptance of the Chief Research Informatics Officer position, and now supporting a variety of tools across campus, those still being 2 of the large ones, but we also help research teams with access to the EPIC research suite of tools. And we now have the Encore system, the clinical trial management system, that we also help support, and I support in that in CRIO role. That's 50% of my time. And so try to dedicate and stick to that split role as much as I can. But as I said before, it's not always as easy as it sounds.
Yeah.
Constantly covering.
What are some, thanks for sharing that, by the way. What are some life hacks you have or you're still exploring that really helps you stay, balance across those roles? Maybe apps or mindfulness practices that you engage in?
Good question. That was not on the list.
No, it wasn't. Well, you gave me the material for that.
Life hacks. Some of the there's a lot of spillover in the guidance that I give on both sides of it because of the emphasis on data here. One of the things that's been hard, it was hard for me personally, and then as I had to start to delegate more and more of my activities to other individuals, particularly in the lab, it was hard to sort of manage the quality control side of analytics. And so an internal policy that I have that, I don't think is unique, but certainly not commonplace, is that any modeling that's done has to be replicated in multiple systems. There's not an answer key to the analyses that you run with real data. And so the compromise I made long ago was that I would always try and get the team now to try to replicate their results in multiple systems. So we're primarily now an R shop. Almost everything we do is in R. So it's okay to run the models in multiple R packages, but preference early on was to try to run something in R and something in SAS and get converging results. So I don't know if that's a life hack necessarily, but it's served us well, and I think it's led to identification of analytic problems a lot earlier than we would have otherwise.
Yeah.
Other life hacks. The database side of it and then the method side of it. I skipped over this piece, but along the way to accepting the CRIO role, the Department of Peds, where my section is housed, asked me to direct a methods core. And I agreed to do it, but early on, sort of my stipulation, my key stipulation was that from the top down, they promote our involvement in research studies as early as possible. And, I love the old quote, and I'm going to butcher it. Sorry, Mo, because I didn't practice this, but
that's okay.
Singer and Willett, I think, and maybe they're borrowing it from somebody else, that you can't fix by analysis what you bungle by design. Sort of that was our motto from day one, and we still use that to this day. So I'm, again, not a life hack and certainly not original, but kind of the path or the model that the team uses to motivate the work we do.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I love hearing about your emphasis on being able to replicate the research. And that's a standard I think everyone should take from that episode, from your story so far as well. Let's segue a little bit into the dissemination and implementation science space, so the D&I. If you think about Oklahoma specific statistics, there are a lot of challenges with that. I think it was the United Health Foundation that did the American Health Ranking. Oklahoma consistently ranks in the bottom 10 states for overall health outcomes. Nearly 1 in 5 Oklahoma children has experienced traumatic events by the age of 17. So when we talk about ACEs, adverse childhood events, so that makes Oklahoma the 9th highest state for ACEs in kids. And then our rural counties face additional challenges, with some having no pediatrician within 100 miles. And of course, these realities demand us to be innovative in our approaches to implementation science. Given just this sobering statistics about Oklahoma, especially among rural and underserved children, how has this shaped the way you and your team approach implementation science in your work?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think fortunately for me, and maybe it's just because I'm brainwashed into thinking this way, being trained in a psychology graduate program, that the key to implementation is behavior, right? So it is sort of this outcome in and of itself, and it's what makes implementation science separate from the other clinical and translational sciences. It's really this add-on piece that even once you know perhaps the secret ingredients to an evidence-based practice, there's a behavioral aspect to how you disseminate that and how you implement it. And if you don't know what that recipe looks like, then you're setting yourself up for failure. And we've seen time and time again with the evidence impact gap. And it really doesn't matter what discipline you look at. It exists across the board, that what we see in the early clinical trials that establish the evidence, it's really difficult to replicate those findings and certainly those early effects. A lot of that we think boils down to the quality of implementation and really the understanding of how to implement with quality.
Thank you. So when translating evidence into action in places like Oklahoma, what adaptations or even innovations have you found to have made the biggest difference?
Well, something we didn't really choose this, but I have found it very helpful, and I'd like to think that it's highly impactful on the quality of services that are offered, at least the ones that we work with directly, is we have embedded ourselves in continuous quality improvement methodologies. And about 7 years ago, we pivoted away from an early crude approach to quality improvement when we were just sort of getting our footing there, to a system that was established out of Chicago. They now call it the COIN system, the Collaborative Improvement and Innovation Network approach. It's a highly structured CQI approach. We do this with a lot of our prevention programs for adverse childhood experiences. And we engage the agencies really in small and many scientific projects, studying aspects of how they implement, either identifying where there might be weaknesses or actually working on, we call them change ideas, or the methodology refers to it as a change idea that can strengthen a known weakness. So it's really a neat blend of the work that we had done previously, mostly with field trials, sort of the second phase of a clinical trial, but a lot more control over manipulating what individual clients or patients are exposed to, and now matriculating into this quality science, quality improvement space where we don't have as much control, and rarely do we are afforded the opportunity to randomize conditions, but we can still be learning things by setting up these learning health environments with agencies that are well educated, well trained to conduct these mini research studies on quality improvement and quality assurance.
Thank you. So, implementation science, we know there's a saying about it takes about 17 years to go from bench to bedside, right? And that timeline is simply sometimes too long for communities facing urgent health crises. And particularly in Oklahoma, where health disparities are pronounced, the stakes of faster, more effective implementation are particularly high. Now, from your experience so far, what do you think makes dissemination and implementation D&I science unique in applied public health, and can you share an Oklahoma-based example of that impact?
Well, again, this evidence impact gap that's existed across multiple disciplines now really can't be ignored. So I don't think anybody's satisfied with finding a clinical service that seems to be effective in a highly controlled and structured environment that then falls apart once it's rolled out into the real world. So that's always been what sort of fascinated me. I mentioned it before that, despite the quantitative and the methods training, that was always sort of a means to an end. I wanted to be skilled enough in those particular areas that it didn't hold me back. Mm-hmm. But I was interested in applied work, particularly with health outcomes, where I could see real world impact. And so I think that's what's exciting about implementation and dissemination. It's that that's where the rubber meets the road. So now that we know what appears or can be effective, how can we roll it out so that we can see broad public impact?
Got it. Thanks. So we've talked a lot about real world data, and I think we should define what that means. So you being a national voice on real world data, how do you define it and why does it matter? Especially for our listeners who have no idea what this is all about.
Yeah. And the term is a little controversial. Not everybody likes the label there, but the idea is that this is data that's being collected for some other purpose than research. In my case, it's a clinical purpose or some health-related purpose, behavior health even purpose, but not carefully collected, and certainly the systems that are collecting it are not designed for a research study. So for example, there's very rarely a restriction on eligibility criteria for those who receive a service. They're going to collect data on anybody who walks through the door, whereas in our clinical trials, we often have a very narrow definition of these are the people we want to study, and we want to rule out any of these other possible alternative explanations for the findings that we get, and therefore we limit who we can enroll. I don't know if that's a luxury or not, and in some ways that's actually a hindrance. So it's one of the exciting but also challenging aspects of real-world data. Real-world data, of course, is messy and a lot messier than your research data. You don't have validation checks set up to the same extent that you would in a research study. It's really difficult to control the subjective bias of one data enterer to the next. And these are all things that you have to take into consideration when you're working on projects that involve real-world data. One of the most challenging things that we encounter on both sides of the work that I do is harmonizing data across systems. So a lot of the work involves real-world data coming from multiple places, and how do you blend that together, especially when there may be similar content that exists in both of those data sources, but it's recorded in different ways, and there are different, behavioral and workflows that led to the result that you see. You have to really understand that. They call this provenance in the world of data informatics. You have to understand where the data came from, why it might look different, if you're going to harmonize it, and then extract some meaning from it.
Okay. I had a follow-up question about just harmonization and working with systems. But before I ask that, I wanted to piece a little bit of the puzzle together. So you've defined real-world data, and thanks for that definition, by the way. In what ways would you say you've seen some of the most promising ways on how real-world data has helped to improve either equity or informed policy, especially in Oklahoma?
Well, we rely on real-world data in my lab, for instance, to evaluate where services are being offered, and using geospatial analysis, we try to layer on top of that, are the services being proportionally delivered in areas of greatest need? So that's one way we try to attack this idea of health equity. So there's always limited resources. Certainly the services that we evaluate or research cannot be offered to every single Oklahoman. And one of the key interests of our group and of the agencies, we work with a lot of state agencies and federal agencies, a lot of their interest is, are we disseminating these services in the areas where the need is greatest? And so that's something that we've been looking at, and again, sort of leaning on geospatial analyses and a lot of small area data that exists now. It's amazing what now you can get even off the internet for free about all of these various indices of social and health inequity, and then layering that with the service capacity that's being disseminated to those areas.
Thank you. So going back to when you're talking about real world data, one of the things you mentioned was trying to harmonize these different systems and to piece, working template as a way to really help with what you're doing and what your lab, works with. So I imagine that working with real world data, particularly in fragmented health systems, presents unique challenges. And in Oklahoma, we have so many of them, hospitals, federally qualified health centers, dozens of different EMR systems who sometimes don't even communicate to one another, right? And we also know from research that a lot of our healthcare data remained locked in silos, which makes it very hard for comprehensive analysis to be done. What lessons would you say you've learned about working with EMRs or electronic medical records or messy real-world data sets in Oklahoma clinics or hospitals?
I think maybe the main lesson I've learned is I'm going to borrow a term from a colleague at West Virginia who's doing similar work, to not let perfect be the enemy of the good, and that you can drive yourself insane hours on end trying to think of all of the different ways the biases and the way that the data may be misleading you. But to not get too wrapped up in that to the point where you're paralyzed. I think that's one main point I learned early on, that you have to compromise and that this is really an art and a science. So standardization is important, and we're fortunate that there are advances being made every day in how we harmonize across systems by way of standardizing data inputs. But we're still far from the day where we're going to be able to do this and perfectly, precisely measure what we intend to measure.
Thank you. Now, one of the things as someone who has, works with OSCTR, who's the founder of this podcast, is in talking to early and mid-stage career investigators, they talk about silos, especially in our universities, but also across, institutions in Oklahoma, which is not, uncommon for spaces where there's a lot of academic innovations being done. Silos are just one of those things that, as a result of that. Now, what strategies have you found to be useful in overcoming those data silos or gaps, especially in rural or pediatric settings that you've worked with?
I've been very fortunate, again, sort of standing on the shoulders of some giants early on in development of behavior pediatrics who had already developed these relationships with state agencies for sharing data that I took for granted in the early years. And then, at national conferences, my third or fourth year on the job, realized this is unique. This is not happening all across the world. And there are a lot of people who are very envious of the data that we now have at our fingertips. So I think I lucked into a lot of those relationships. Data governance is obviously a field that's evolving very rapidly, and we're trying to find better ways to safely share data and preserve privacy of the individuals who are represented in those data sets. Having to learn a lot about that now in the CRIO role that I fulfill, and leaning on some other universities who've been a little bit further ahead of us in this field to figure out how they navigate this space. That led 4 or 5 years ago to the establishment of a new governance body that I co-chair. It often gets referred to by its acronym, CRIOC, the Clinical Research Informatics Oversight Committee, where we're applying some of these governance principles for data, trying to do the best we can to protect the integrity and also the privacy of the individuals. Yeah, and we've had our share of failures over time, but I think enough successes too that we're now able to leverage those. I'll give you some examples with state agencies. We've had fabulous working relationships with our Department of Human Services and our Department of Health and our Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, and we've been able to act. Oh, and I would also throw in our Oklahoma Healthcare Authority.
Oh, nice.
Wonderful examples of where I've got 2 projects right now where we have active DUAs with all 4 of those agencies, and we're merging data from vital records from the health department with Medicaid utilization and health outcomes data from OCA. We're looking at substance use and access to prevention services, recovery services from the DMH system. And then we're also looking at, because of my interest in adverse childhood experiences and sort of the the worst case scenario of that, which is child abuse and neglect, we're looking at involvement with our child protective services agencies. We have a number of projects like that in-house, and again, this has been happening in this state now for more than 2 decades. So we've got lots of precedent to lean on, and it's grown. Other states have taken notice, so we've provided some advice to others who are now able to do the same thing, and in some cases even go beyond what we've been able to do here in Oklahoma.
Yeah. All right. Thanks. So you've talked about OSAs and even just the role it plays in surveilling data and gathering those documents that we need for example, in really looking at what's going on with our health equity issues in Oklahoma. And when it comes to ACEs, right, we've seen that strike children from, say, for example, Native American background, they face higher rates of adversity. And then those in rural background as well, of all backgrounds, they encounter barriers to like mental health services and those average distances to pediatric mental health. Now, how do you ensure that your research tools and data systems don't unintentionally reinforce this bias when it comes to health equity and access in Oklahoma?
Well, that too is an evolving area, and there are more and more techniques and best practices being disseminated in literature that we're trying to stay abreast on and then apply in our own work. But so I think we've done it with varying degrees of success historically. Early days, some of the work that we do is in the predictive modeling space. And that's one area where we're always very nervous about creating a predictive model that may be unintentionally biased to some subset of individuals. And so how do we protect against that? Well, the first step is let's not incorporate any of the indicators of those subgroups in our predictive models. But that's really not sufficient. I mean, in the early days, I think we could use that for justification. Nowadays, we have to build the models, and then we have to evaluate by looking at those subgroups that we're getting the same outcomes and that the outcomes mean the same thing across those groups. So it's something that we evaluate directly now in our predictive modeling work. So if we're going to develop a particular model, we look to see does it have the same operational characteristics, sensitivity and specificity across these various subgroups that we're really concerned about. Maybe the data may not be telling us the same story because of the way that it's collected or because of the limited access to services that those groups may have. Okay.
Thank you for sharing that. I think next question will be about building trust with communities that we serve, especially around data collection. So we had a lot of guests on the podcast, and if I were to just summarize what I've learned about working with diverse communities is the importance of trust, especially data autonomy, how we interpret the data privacy. And we know that from research that communities with high ACEs exposure often have lower trust in institutions, making traditional research approaches less effective. And for us to have those successful community-engaged research, we need to be transparent. We need to practice reciprocity and what the benefit looks like net positively to the community providing data. What does it look like for you to earn the trust from communities that you work with, particularly underserved ones, when data is involved?
Yeah, great question. Again, fortunate to lean on a lot of experts in my own backyard. So I'll talk about my lab here.
Yeah.
Those are the most readily available examples. A dear colleague, Jane Salewski, who now is the director of that Child Abuse and Neglect Center that I mentioned before, helped establish years ago a Parent Partnership Advisory Council, or PPAC as we call it. And it's comprised of a number of parents who've been former clients of services that we commonly research. We lean on that council. The membership changes all the time, but we lean on that council constantly. So they meet monthly, and I'm usually on the agenda every quarter to talk about the research studies that we're engaged in. And we start early on. So sort of like our motto for the core that I run in pediatrics on methodology to have the methodologists engaged early. We feel the same way about the participants that we're studying, trying to get them engaged early on in our research studies, even before the protocol is built. So these are the types of research questions that we are interested in. Does this resonate with you? Is this answering a question that you think really is important to the community? So, I mean, it really starts from scratch with conversations with the participants that we enroll in these studies. And we keep them engaged and updated on the research progress, beginning to end. In the middle, we're asking them about implementation difficulties we're having, for instance, recruitment of participants. If we're struggling there, we show them our recruitment materials and we explain what our target sample size is and how far off we are and gather their advice on how can we close that gap. And they always have very insightful things to share, oftentimes things that, would never occur to us. And then at the end, once we've got all the data and we're ready to disseminate, they're our first audience, and we take the data to them first. In more recent years, we've been trying to actually engage them in the interpretation of that data. So not just interpret it ourselves and then bounce it off of them as an audience, but actually show them the data and have them tell us how to interpret it. So this data walk idea, we're engaged in that now for the last 3 years or so.
I love that. That's great. Yeah. That's really great. Data walk idea. That's really great. Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about AI, right? We've had several guests on the podcast and who work in different fields, and they've expressed their thoughts, which I'll let you know by the time you're done with yours. Now, I believe that the integration of AI in healthcare research presents both an amazing opportunity, but also significant ethical challenges. And my premise is that as humans, we're the final writer, right? Being able to serve as early warning signs for the potential harm it can do, but still not being afraid of embracing the immense opportunity that lies in its use. Now, in pediatric research, I imagine that these considerations are amplified because, one, children cannot consent to data use. And if we have those algorithms in place, depending on how they're set up, they can do more damage by widening existing health disparities. And I imagine that with Oklahoma's diverse population, including significant rural and Native American communities, how we can make sure that there's equitable AI implementation, particularly across board, that remains a huge challenge. And so my question for you is this: what excites and concerns you about the role of AI and tech in research, especially from an ethical lens here in Oklahoma, taking into consideration the kind of topography we have right here?
I would say I'm a little more focused on the optimistic side of the advantages of AI than I am the dangers of it. And I'm not dismissing the dangers. I'm relying on others, I suppose, who are more expert in that to tell me these are the best practices. But it's undeniable the benefits AI will and already is bringing to the field. Just by way of example, the old adage has been that in our EMR system, for example, 80% of the information is stored in an unstructured field, not a structured field. And yet almost all of our work historically, locally and nationally with repurposing clinical data has been focused on structured fields. And there's plenty of challenges just in how people store data in structured fields. The unstructured data was sort of the holy grail for many years, and now AI is finally allowing us to, in an aggregate, data. So 80% of the information lives in these unstructured data, and it really was an impediment to dive into that data until AI advances of late, where we can feed that textual information to AI, have it interpret it. I was going to say in the same way a human does, but in many ways, maybe even better than a human can. and then create the structured data for us to evaluate. We can do that in mass numbers that were never feasible to us in traditional ways of manual chart abstraction, having humans go through those unstructured fields, record in a case report form the interpretation of that, and then analyze it. That takes forever and a day to accomplish, and is not great use of some of those research members' time. So AI, I think, is going to have an incredible impact on certainly the productivity of clinical sciences, but also allow us access to this rich data that's been stored in unstructured ways.
Yeah.
So that's the optimistic side of it. On the challenge side of it, and the potential biases, I go back to our conversation earlier with predictive modeling and whether it's extracting the data or actually running models using AI. Both of those are promising avenues of how this new resource gets utilized, but come with a lot of the same concerns we've had historically, that maybe just exacerbated because of the increased productivity and then the increased amount of data that it can consume and create outputs for. But you have to be worried about, where did the data come from? And
right.
Is it predicting based on the biases that are inherent in that data collection process?
Yeah. That's a question we have to keep asking ourselves, right? Yeah. All right. Before you leave, I just have some tiny enough questions to do. Now, you, in your role, I imagine you've done a lot of mentoring and you still keep doing that. Now, for those who might be listening to this and are still much early in their career, what kind of advice would you like to give them, given just what you've been able to accomplish and what has helped you so far?
I do a lot of mentoring, and I knew early on in graduate school I didn't want to be in a classroom every semester, every week. That was part of what attracted me to a health sciences campus. I enjoy being able to give lectures periodically, and I really enjoy the one-on-one mentorship opportunities that were afforded, at least in my pediatrics section. I've been mentoring more and more junior faculty over the years. A lot of those junior faculty have some shared interest in my labs work, particularly the connecting tissue there is often social determinants of health, but also the informatics side of it. So two recent examples are David Noyd and Manzi Akande. Manzi was a OSCTR pilot awardee this last year, and I think David had one. Yeah, David had one a few years prior to that. My camera, sorry.
That's okay.
It's been on the outs for a couple of weeks. I need a new one.
It's okay.
I would say never be afraid to ask for help, and certainly never be afraid to admit what you don't know, right? In some ways, that's a luxury. The older you get, the harder that question is to ask. But in your early years, everybody expects you not to know that. And if you don't recognize it and you don't explicitly mention it, they may actually question whether you are fully equipped for this career. If you have the right personality for example. So anyway, that's something that I've never really had trouble, I think, with most of the students I work with, but asking for that assistance, I should say. But it is something that I try to address early on, that, I expect you to ask questions. I expect you not to know these things, and it's okay to admit that. I don't want you to just lean on me for expertise. You have plenty of experts all across this campus. You have this wealth of information here at your disposal. Take advantage of it while you can. These are some constant themes of the mentoring sessions that I hold.
I love that. Ask questions, and it's okay not to know stuff, and take advantage of just the mentoring that you have around you. Thanks for sharing that. Is there anything you would if you could go back in time and change anything about your trajectory and what you've accomplished so far, is there anything you would change about your path or do differently?
Well, I have constant thoughts about the what ifs, and it's not really a regret. It's more of a curiosity. Like as I said early on in the interview process, I've always had sort of broad interest and broad involvement in projects, and it hasn't allowed me to really drill deeply into any particular topic. But that what if question comes to mind quite frequently. So what if I hadn't gone that route, and instead of being involved in such broad areas, I was specializing in one particular area and was able to reach depths there that I never can in my current career. Started out in genetics, so certainly envisioned early on that might be an area where I would drill in deeply. I know now that that's not going to happen. I'm okay with that again, but always sort of this curiosity of what would life have been like if that had been my sole focus, and how deep would I have gone?
Yeah. Thank you. So lightning round. What's your go-to phrase when talking to policymakers or funders about the impact of your research?
Go-to phrase. I don't have to sell them on that very often, believe it or not. Yeah, we a lot of our work is a response to an RFA or an RFP, so they recognize the problem, but I've certainly had to pitch, and I'm having to do this more now as funding becomes tighter. This is a lousy example, and I'm kind of paraphrasing here a little bit.
It's okay.
Taking on one specific context, but I remember early days following around one of those mentors, Mark Chaffin, that I mentioned before, having to convince state agencies on the utility of a randomized trial, and that we can run a lot of these program evaluations for you with sort of before and after comparisons of what your clients look like, but until you actually compare what would happen in this alternative scenario of not getting that service, you're never really going to know how effective this is. And can you live with that? Do you really want your life to have that looming over your head, or do you want to know the answer?
Yeah. I like that. It's taking it back to a language that you can understand and showing them the cost benefit of your intervention. So next question for you will be, what's the most underrated tool or framework you rely on in your research?
Now, I'd say graphical analyses.
Okay.
And had a graduate school quantitative co-mentor sort of drill into my head early on that, never analyze the data before you've actually graphed it and looked at it. I think I took that for granted for several years until I was in this seat and having to work with my own data set and realizing, sometimes the model can lead you astray if you're not looking at the picture first. Barbara Neves is a great example here too. So I took as many courses as I could in the biostat department, knowing again I wanted to study some health outcomes. So although my main program was on the Norman campus, I was on this campus quite a bit, not just for research but also for studies. And Barbara Neves was one of my early epi biostatistics teachers and mentors, and she gave me advice that I still follow to this day, which is that never trust a complicated model unless there's converging evidence from a very simple model that you could generate as a Stat 101 student. And so and that's another one of those sort of best practices or life hacks, is that what we called them earlier, I guess, that I've leaned on. Don't run to the press with your complex model until you can get simple models to tell you something very similar.
Occam's razor, right? Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Okay. Now, one thing we do on the podcast is we highlight two things. One is how OSCTR, which is the sponsor of this podcast, has helped you or is helping you with your research. Are you able to highlight some of the ways you've partnered or benefited from OSCTR?
Well, the obvious one is that for the research data warehouse work that we've done, they were heavy subsidizers for many years. And really, we could not have built that resource into what it is today without that support. So the warehouse now houses all of the hospital and the clinic data that comes out of Epic. We're an Epic customer as of June 2023. But in that warehouse, we also have quite a bit of the legacy data. We have essentially all of the outpatient legacy data that used to be stored in our GE Centricity data system. And we have most of the tables that commonly get used for research out of our, the hospital side, which was a Meditech EMR system.
Yeah.
And, pulling that data in, harmonizing it, and then we standardize it. That took years of work that required funding, and OCTR was able to provide that in the early years and up until very recently. It has also opened up some avenues. So I had a pilot grant in my lab for a parenting app. So in the dissemination implementation side here, one of the things we've been studying of late is what can we do to supplement parenting advice of many of the services that we evaluate in between sessions. So a lot of the services that we study, they offer sessions once a week or every other week. Well, that's a lot of days and hours in between. And the kids, it's not like you get reprieve from them. You've got to parent them in between those sessions. So how can we be providing good evidence-based advice? And we've been tinkering with a parenting app. And we had a pilot study from OCTR that helped us in early days decide what might be working well, what might not.
Thank you for that. Now, what keeps you hopeful, and also what's one misconception about your work you wish more people understood?
What keeps me hopeful? Well, you mentioned AI, and again, I guess to me the glass is half full here, and I'm really excited to see where this takes us. I think personally, I'm really interested and excited about the increased productivity that I think that this is going to lend to researchers.
Thank you. And what keeps you? What's one misconception you wish people understood about your work?
Misconception. This is not a great answer, sorry, but this has changed over time. So maybe it was a misconception early years, but I guess I'm pleased to say that it's no longer the case. Adverse childhood experiences. I mean, early days in my DBP faculty role, nobody outside of the clinicians and the researchers really knew what that was and knew the potential impact of that on health broadly, physical and mental. But I mean, there's a funny story. Yeah, I was selling, I don't even remember what it was, something off of, I don't know if it was Craigslist back then or Facebook Marketplace, but somebody showed up at my house from rural Oklahoma to buy something. And
Give them your address?
Yeah, I gave him my address.
Oh, okay. I thought it just showed up without you.
No. Okay. Online, negotiated, came to
Okay.
showed up in my driveway to pick up something substantial, some kind of furniture, I think.
Okay.
And not knowing what I did, this individual who was a principal for a high school in some rural county that I'm forgetting now, was educating me on adverse childhood experiences. Like, have you ever heard of this? And do you know what impact it has on physical and mental health?
Wow.
So that's just a sign of how times have changed, and in particular how the original investigators there have done a fabulous job of sort of disseminating that evidence, not just to academia and to healthcare organizations, but also to the lay public.
Thank you. Now, lastly, will be on this podcast, we leave questions for our future guests. So we have about 8 questions that have been left behind by other guests. I'm not going to have you answer all 8 of them. You choose a number between 1 and 8, and I'll tell you which question and who asked it.
I give you a number between 1 and 8. You're going to read it, and then I have to guess who asked it.
No. I'm going to read the question out to you, and you answer it, and then you leave a question for the next guest.
Oh, I see. Okay. How about number 2?
Number 2. So this is from Becky Manuel. She actually came on the podcast last month. She wanted me to ask, what inspires you about the work we do? or the work you do?
What inspires me about the work that I do? Well, it was not, I was studying health outcomes broadly. The first research assistantship outside of the Norman campus I had was in family medicine. We were largely studying adults, doing a lot of cancer screening prevention. I was fascinated by that work. I was fascinated by behavior change. As I said, I ended up in pediatrics, continuing my pursuit of some genetics work, and then that led to this position in DBP. I never in a million years imagined myself working in a DBP section, but it was easy to fall in love with the research topic, and particularly the patients, clients that are served. Eventually had my own kids, and it took on even greater meaning at that moment. As I've said now multiple times in this podcast, I really wanted early days of graduate school to be able to see the fruits of my labor in the reflected back to me in the real world. And that's what I really love about the work that we do. And there's something intrinsically rewarding perpetually about doing that for young kids.
That is beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Now, what question would you like to leave for the next guest? We don't know who that person is, and they don't know who you are.
Question. Okay. I may bungle the articulation here, but something to the effect of how do we adapt and maybe even react to the changing research funding landscape?
Ooh. Yep.
That's now at our doorstep.
That's a good one.
What are some key strategies to survival there?
Yeah. These are unprecedented times. Thank you so much. We have spent a lot of time today. I just want to say thank you so much for your grace. And I really enjoyed chatting with you. I think what strikes me the most about your work is how you've been able to manage both the scientific rigor and the humanity in your approach to some of the pressing challenges we have in Oklahoma. And for our listeners, I want to emphasize a few key takeaways from today's conversation. First, the power of real-world data to reveal not just what works, but what works for whom and under what conditions. And I think Dr. Bard's OSS system exemplifies how innovative data collection can really help highlight the problems that might otherwise remain hidden in aggregate statistics. And secondly, I think the critical importance of implementation science in a state like Oklahoma. Like, it's not just enough for us to know what intervention works, but we also need to understand how to adapt and deliver them effectively across, our diverse communities, from urban Tulsa to our rural panhandle towns. And then lastly but definitely not the least, would be the ethical imperative that comes with working with vulnerable populations and sensitive data. And he emphasized innovation without equity can actually worsen those disparity gaps. So for everyone listening, including researchers, those who support them, and practitioners, we hope that his story today has really shown you the value of interdisciplinary thinking and the willingness to bridge traditional academic silos, and how he's evolved from psychology to informatics to even implementation science shows just how most impactful work often happens at the intersections of fields. So thank you all so much for listening today, and thank you so much, David, for coming on. It was really a pleasure talking to you and hearing a lot of the behind the scenes. We see all of the work you guys do, and just hearing a little bit about that and what has formed all of that has been such a great time well spent on the podcast, and I hope it was the same for you as well.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. I appreciate the invitation.